On the first day of his imprisonment at Auschwitz, Viktor Frankl was processed. That is the word the Nazis used, processed, as though what was happening was a bureaucratic operation, a matter of filing and cataloguing and routing. He was stripped of his clothes. His belongings were taken. His wedding ring was removed. The manuscript concealed in the lining of his coat, years of work, his first major systematic presentation of his ideas, was confiscated and destroyed. He was shaved, disinfected, issued a prison uniform, and given a number. From that point forward, inside the camp, he was not Viktor Frankl. He was not a physician, not a husband, not a son, not a Viennese intellectual with a full and particular life. He was 119,104, a number on a uniform, an item in a list. The Nazi system of dehumanization was, as many historians have observed, extraordinarily deliberate and sophisticated. It was not merely cruel, it was theoretically informed cruelty, cruelty in service of a specific psychological and ideological objective, the destruction of the prisoner's sense of being a person. A person has a name, a history, a set of relationships, a range of choices, a future to which they are oriented. Remove all of these and what remains should not be a person. What remains should be a creature defined entirely by its immediate biological needs and by the demands placed on it by external power. This is what the camps were designed to produce. And in many prisoners, as Frankl observed with the unflinching honesty of a trained psychiatrist, it succeeded. But it did not succeed in everyone. And Frankl's most fundamental question, the question that organized his entire intellectual project, before the camps and through them and after, was, why? What was it in some prisoners that could not be reached by the most systematic and comprehensive program of dehumanization ever devised? What, precisely, survived when everything external had been stripped away? The answer he arrived at was not a comfortable one, and it was not simple. But it was, he was convinced, true. What survived was what he called the noetic dimension of the human being, the dimension of the spirit, the irreducible core of personhood that cannot be fully captured by any account that reduces the human being to biology, to psychology, to social construction, or to historical circumstance. This concept, the noetic dimension, is central to Frankl's entire system and is easy to misunderstand. He was not making a claim about the soul in any traditional religious sense, though he was open to that interpretation and engaged seriously with theology throughout his career. He was making a claim that is prior to theology and independent of it, a phenomenological claim about the structure of human existence as it presents itself to careful observation. When you examine human beings carefully, not theoretically but empirically, in the full range of their behavior and inner experience, you find something that purely biological or psychological accounts cannot accommodate. You find a dimension of existence that is not determined by drives, not produced by conditioning, not exhausted by social role, a dimension from which the person can take a distance from themselves, can laugh at themselves, can commit to something even when every biological and psychological signal points the other way, can, in the extreme case, choose how to face death. Frankl called this the self-distancing capacity, the human being's ability to step back from itself and regard its own condition as an object of reflection and even humor. He saw this capacity as one of the most reliable markers of the specifically human dimension of existence. Animals cannot laugh at themselves. Machines cannot reflect on their own operation with ironic distance. But a human being, even in conditions of maximum degradation, can. Frankl described prisoners in the camps who had developed, under conditions that should have precluded any lightness, as sardonic humor, black jokes about their situation that expressed, paradoxically, a kind of freedom from it. By laughing at the camp, by naming its absurdity, by treating it from a position of ironic distance, these prisoners were enacting precisely the capacity that the camp was designed to destroy. They were insisting, through their humor, that they were not identical with their situation, that there was a self that stood apart from the number on the uniform and could regard it with something other than pure terror. Frankl's philosophical framework for understanding identity drew on several traditions but synthesized them in a way that was distinctively his own. From Husserl and the phenomenological tradition, he took the commitment to describing experience as it presents itself, without reducing it prematurely to underlying causal mechanisms. From Schiller, he took the concept of the person as an irreducible center of acts, a being that cannot be identified with any of the objects it intends, including its own psychological states. From the existentialists, particularly Jaspers and Heidegger, he took the emphasis on authentic existence as a task rather than a given, on the necessity of choosing one's relation to one's own existence rather than simply being carried along by it. But Frankl combined these influences with something none of his philosophical predecessors had, the direct experience of having his own identity systematically targeted for destruction, and the direct observation of what happened to other people when theirs were targeted. This experience gave his theoretical claims a specific gravity that purely philosophical arguments rarely achieve. When Frankl wrote about the irreducibility of the person, he was not writing from an armchair. He was writing from the evidence of his own survival, and from the evidence of the prisoners he had watched, some of whom maintained their humanity with extraordinary dignity, and some of whom did not. He was scrupulous about not romanticizing this difference. He did not claim that those who maintained their humanity were better people, morally superior in some prior sense, to those who did not. He acknowledged explicitly that the conditions of the camps were designed to break people, and that they broke most people, and that this reflects not on the people but on the conditions. But he insisted that the breaking was not inevitable, that there was, even in those conditions, a dimension of freedom, however constrained, however difficult to access. And in that freedom, there was identity. The person who exercised it was, in doing so, being themselves in the most fundamental sense, enacting the capacity that makes personhood possible. In his clinical work after the war, Frankl encountered a different but related crisis of identity, the identity crises produced not by external catastrophe but by the subtler erosions of modern life. He worked with patients who had built their entire sense of self around a professional role that then disappeared, through retirement, through illness, through organizational change. He worked with patients who had defined themselves through a relationship, as a spouse, a parent, a partner, and then lost that relationship through death or abandonment. He worked with patients who had achieved significant success in some domain and then found, with the achievement in hand, that it had not delivered the sense of being someone that they had expected it to deliver. In each case, what the patient was experiencing was a version of the same crisis that the camps had produced in a more extreme form. The external markers of identity had been removed, and what remained felt insufficient to constitute a self. Frankl's therapeutic response to these identity crises was consistent with his theoretical position and, from a conventional therapeutic perspective, somewhat counterintuitive. He did not work to help patients rebuild their external identity, to find a new role, a new relationship, a new source of status and recognition. He worked to help them discover what was prior to all of those external structures, the noetic dimension that had been the actual ground of their selfhood all along, even when it had been obscured by the overlay of role and relationship and achievement. He would ask questions like, across all the different roles you have played in your life, all the different contexts in which you have acted, what has remained constant? What is it that you recognize as distinctively you, regardless of the external situation? If all of your professional achievements were taken away, if all of your relationships were taken away, if everything that other people know about you were taken away, what would you be? These questions are not easy to answer. Many patients found them initially baffling, because they had never had occasion to think about themselves in this way. But when they thought about them carefully, something almost always emerged, some constellation of values, of characteristic orientations to the world, of particular sensitivities and concerns that had been present across all the different contexts of their lives. This constellation was not their role. It was not their achievement. It was not their relationship. It was them, the specific, singular, irreplaceable them that had been living inside and through all of those external structures. Frankl used a concept from dimensional ontology to illuminate this point. He described the human being as existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, biological, psychological, and noetic, and argued that a full account of any human being must engage with all three dimensions. The biological dimension includes everything that is captured by medicine, the body, its processes, its health and illness. The psychological dimension includes everything captured by conventional psychology, the history of the person, their patterns of behavior, their emotional and cognitive processes. The noetic dimension is what is left when you have given a complete account of both the biological and the psychological and still find that you have not fully described the person. It is the dimension of the person's relationship to their own existence, their freedom, their responsibility, their capacity to take a stand toward whatever conditions are given. This dimensional ontology has a specific implication for understanding identity. The self is not fully described by any account that stops at the biological or psychological dimensions. The self is the noetic center, the point from which all of the biological and psychological material is regarded, responded to, and given meaning. This center is not created by external conditions. It is not produced by success or relationship or professional achievement. It is prior to all of these, the ground from which engagement with these things is possible. And because it is prior, it persists when these things are removed. Not comfortably, not without disorientation, not without the need for significant inner work, but it persists. It is there, available, waiting to be recognized and inhabited. Frankl's most profound expression of this understanding came in his concept of the defiant power of the human spirit, what he sometimes called the trotzdem, the German word meaning despite everything or in spite of it all. A person can say yes to life trotzdem, despite circumstances, despite suffering, despite loss, despite the stripping away of every external support of identity. This trotzdem is not bravado. It is not denial. It is the enactment of the noetic dimension, the demonstration, in the most practical possible way, that the self is not finally reducible to its circumstances. The prisoner who maintained dignity despite everything was not pretending that the circumstances were other than they were. They were asserting, by their behavior, by their choices, by the texture of their daily engagement with even the most degraded conditions, that they were more than their circumstances. That the self had resources that the circumstances could constrain but not eliminate. This is the deepest meaning of what Frankl meant by identity, not a fixed set of characteristics, not a stable biographical narrative, not a collection of social roles, but the ongoing exercise of the freedom to take a stand toward one's own existence. Identity, in this sense, is not something one has but something one does. It is enacted, continuously, in the choices that reflect one's deepest values and commitments. It can be inhibited by circumstances, weakened by illness, distorted by trauma. But it cannot be destroyed by any of these things, only by the person's own final refusal to enact it, the complete abdication of the capacity for self-determination that Frankl observed in the most broken prisoners and that he believed was, in every case, a tragedy rather than an inevitability. The philosophical and psychological implications of this vision are immense. If Frankl is right, and the weight of both his theoretical argument and his empirical evidence suggests powerfully that he is, then identity is indestructible in a way that most people do not recognize when times are good. The crisis of identity that comes with the loss of a role, a relationship, or an achievement is real and painful. But it is not the end of the self. It is an invitation to discover what was there before the role, before the relationship, before the achievement. And what was there, what has always been there, available but often overlooked, is the most durable thing a human being possesses, the noetic core, the irreducible self, the I that can say yes to life despite everything and mean it.